Hi everybody, this is Robert, your instructor for this political science class. Chapter 12, we're going to talk about federalism. And remember, federalism is a system where we have the federal government, the state government, and the local governments. The state government and local governments are considered sub-elites because they have power due to the decentralization of government. Now, kind of the thought on how power should be divided is really based off ideology. People on the left will tend to believe that we need a lot of government in our lives, and people on the right believe that we should not have much government in our lives. But with federal, state, and local, you can see that there's different levels of government. Since I'm in San Diego, I kind of showed the San Diego County um, governing documents. So at the very top, we have the U.S. Constitution, and that's the governing document for everything in the United States. Now, we have a California Constitution under the state government. In the county of San Diego, County of San Diego will run off of a charter. Each city will also have a charter as well. And unincorporated cities, who are cities that aren't really defined by a police or mayor or city council, they operate under the county charter. Now, when we ask people, how much trust do you have in government? Usually, state and local governments get higher scores as opposed to the federal government, as we can see here. Local government, it looks at 71% favorably, state government looks at 62, and the federal government looks at 20. So why? Why do you think this is so? I think one of the points that we can really make with this is that with local and state government, they're a lot more accessible, right? Local government might be people in our community, so we can definitely, get in touch with them. And I think that's why they're looked on more favorably, because we have ways to have access to these leaders. Now, when we talk about the divisions of government, the Constitution lists 18 specific powers that are delegated to Congress. There's also something called the Necessary and Proper Clause, which we'll talk about that. And states have reserved powers according to the 10th Amendment. And the 10th Amendment basically says that the state can do anything that the federal government doesn't do, as long as it doesn't violate the Constitution. Now, when we talk about these delegated powers, these are powers like taxing or having a military, specific powers that are granted to the government, the federal government, and the Congress. Now, when we talk about the state's role in national government, voters' eligibility is determined by the state, right? So in the United States, we have a basic kind of form or basic criteria to vote: 18 U.S. citizen. Now, the states can determine who's eligible to vote past that. So that's why we see different states might have different rules with regards to maybe prisoners and people that get the right to vote abridged, and how the controversy has come out with regards to that. Um, we have senators. The president is chosen by the electoral college, and we need 3/4 of the state legislatures to agree to ratify a constitutional amendment. So when we talk about the necessary and proper clause, the necessary and proper clause is a clause that exists in the Constitution that says Congress has the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or department or office thereof. So, one thing that we call this with the necessary and proper clause, it's also called the elastic clause, meaning that we can fit a lot of things into this meaning, right? So if the federal government is going to pass a law and it's not specifically mentioned in the Constitution, can Congress do that? In a sense, yes, if we can rationalize that what we are doing is to execute one of those delegated powers. So the Congress has the power to tax, the power to control federal spending, but can a Congress pass a law that's not specifically mentioned in the Constitution? Much like the Machiavelli kind of belief, is that in order for the means of laws to be justified, you have to have an end game with it, right? So the ends must justify the means. So there's a case called U.S. versus Comstock, and let's go over it a little bit. This was challenged in court as a result of something called the Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act. And if any of you watched America's Most Wanted, John Walsh is the host, and his son Adam Walsh was killed by a sex offender. So what happens is the Walsh Act organizes sex offenders into 3 tiers, and we all kind of know this, right? Tier 3, Tier 2, and Tier 1. Now, when we go and look, into this deeper, this also gives the federal government the authority to hold someone accused of a child molestation past the release date if the federal government still believes that person is a danger to society. Okay? Federal law allows a district court to order the civil commitment of a mentally ill, sexually dangerous federal prisoner beyond the date he otherwise would release. This is 18 U.S. United States Code, Section 4248. Okay, so what's the meaning of this? All right, so if we look at this criteria, once a person's sentence is completed, can the federal government still hold that person past their release date? The Adam Walsh Protection and Safety Act put this into play, and what it does is it gives a person that is accused or has been convicted of molestation, if they still believe that they're a danger to society, they can still be committed past their sentence. Now, I'm very much a constitutionalist, and this doesn't mention the Constitution, but when we look at this federal statute, it is very, very hard to argue against it, right? Should we release somebody that still might be a danger to society even though the prison sentence has been completed? So, this was challenged in federal court. Comstock finished the sentence and was to be released. He was not released as he was civilly committed and still considered a danger to society. The Supreme Court found that the Constitution was not exceeding their authority due to the necessary and proper clause, meaning that the federal government, the Congress, has the right to construct courts and protection of the people as part of their enumerated powers. So we look a little bit and they kind of talk about how they use the rationale to come to the decision that they did. Now, the Civil War was our greatest crisis, and federalism could a state voluntarily leave the Union. We know about that. Prohibition was enacted and repealed as the federal government, banned on the states. Civil rights comes out of this flow. The 14th Amendment says no state shall deprive anybody of life, liberty, and property without due process of law. And we all are entitled to equal protection under the law. So the federal government makes this decision, and the state governments have to follow it. Also, the Interstate Commerce Clause, which gives Congress the power to regulate and distribute goods. We talked about the 16th Amendment, which enacted our income tax. And, as a result of this, grants are allowed by the federal government to expand powers in the state and local government. When we talk about, kind of the duties of state and local government, dual federalism or layer-cake federalism was the first system of government that we had during the first 110 years of our country. National government concentrated on the delegated powers in the Constitution, and the states decided important domestic policy issues. Now, we go in and kind of look from 1901 to 1969. We have something called cooperative federalism or marble cake federalism, where both the nation and states exercise responsibility for things like welfare, healthcare, highways, education, criminal justice. So an example is where you see a lot of, here in California, we see a lot of kind of work on the highways and the freeways. So Caltrans here in California works with the federal government through grants to maintain our highways. The government provides grants, and we use them. These are generated by tax revenue, and it funds interstate highways. The states are allowed to oversee the construction and maintenance process in accordance with goals set by the national government. So we'll see Caltrans working in conjunction with the national government to upkeep our freeways. We also had New Federalism, the Great Society through LBJ, set forth goals that declared all problems of society were national problems. And now we have a kind of a philosophy of New Federalism. Nixon believed that local and state government should be a more effective way of determining what day-to-day needs for the local and state governments. And Reagan also proposed a greater flexibility in use of funds. Clinton's Welfare Reform Act was a kind of a thing that was put into place where the federal government would give money to the states to run the welfare system. It will provide temporary financial assistance while getting people off that assistance, primarily through unemployment. So TANF, which was a thing that was created by the PRWORA, kind of put a limit on how long people could be on welfare. And when they were receiving cash aid, they would have to, maybe work or provide some type of child care to a person also on financial aid, or go to school or go into a vocational school, kind of justifying or using a way to try to get off of welfare. We also have some instances of coercive federalism or mandates that come from the federal government. One really good example of this is the ADA, or the Americans with Disability Act. This is a law that the federal government puts in place, and state and local governments need to perform these activities to comply with federal laws. If they don't, they are opening themselves to a fine and a lawsuit. So if we notice with the ADA, it makes everything a lot more accessible for people. If you have to have elevators, you have to have ramps, you have to have a certain number of disabled parking per parking spaces that you have. So a lot of things that come into play with the ADA. Okay, so we talked about that. Let's go ahead and, we have block grants. So make sure you know what a block grant is. Block grants are money that are granted by the federal government to state and local. They are earmarked for specific projects. And category grants are grants that are given for a specific purpose. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump to civil rights in chapter 13. Remember, I mentioned in a post here that we're not going to go over chapter 14. We're going to stop at chapter 13. So how have elites diversified? By 2018, here's some list of accomplishments that have gone on in our state and our federal government. And if you look at those links, it'll show you how many people of color and different religions are in Congress. African Americans have to overcome slavery, segregation, and other civil rights limitations. We had the desegregation of schools in 1955 and kind of that stopping of the segregated facilities. Why did those continue into the 60s? I always like to say, what good is a law if there's nobody there to enforce it, right? So a lot of these kind of Jim Crow laws that were going on in the South were because some of the local law enforcement people weren't enforcing the law. Hispanics had been denied citizenship and had immigration restricted. Asian Americans have survived exclusionary laws, legal discrimination, and domestic rights. Democratic rights. The American dilemma, when we talk about it, is all men are created equal. But at what point slaves were considered 3/5 of a person? African Americans struggle for freedom. Here's some constitutional amendments that were passed. The Plessy case, which determined that facilities were able to be segregated even as long as they were equal. As we all know, they weren't. The NAACP and the Urban League were two big organizations that came into play to help the advancement of African American rights. There was originally resistance to desegregation. In order to accomplish this desegregation, military force was needed. We've probably all seen Forrest Gump in the scene of the governor of Alabama standing in the doorway, not letting the young lady go into the University of Alabama because it was being desegregated. George Wallace. That was a good example, and it was desegregated by military force. Talked about Jim Crow laws. The Martin Luther King movement was a very effective movement. It was a nonviolent, bearing witness, and a willingness to accept penalty to help emphasize injustice. Now, when we talk about the nonviolent technique that Martin Luther King Jr. used, this was a very, very effective technique. Why? Um, it, I think, with it being nonviolent, it generated a lot of sympathy from Northern whites that were able to assist in the movement. I think if it would have been more violent, people would have been turned off. And remember, this was one of the first things that kind of, first movements that kind of used the news and TV as a way to, in a sense, push an agenda. And I think when people saw, protesters getting sprayed with fire hoses, which is very dangerous, and dogs attacked on with them, I think it's a very, very good illustration that empathy and sympathy was used in this case. Latino Americans, we talked a little bit about that, immigration. We used to have something called the Bracero program, which imported Mexican labor until 1964. There's a case in 1947 called Mendez versus Westminster School District. Westminster, California, which is, I think outside in Orange County. They had specific schools for Mexicans, so if you had a certain skin tone or surname, you were sent to a different school. They eventually found that the segregation was not racially based, but it had to be implemented by the school district without being specifically authorized by state law. Therefore, you couldn't do it. We talked about Asian Americans, the multiracial rights movement. 67 struck down all laws banning interracial marriage, which was the Loving case, Loving versus Virginia. And in 2000, the census, which we're going to be doing next year, allowed checking more than one box for race. Talked about the 1964 Act, Civil Rights Act. And then we have the concept of affirmative action. Do we still have affirmative action laws here in the United States? There's one case that kind of came out of this, the Regents of University of California versus Bakke. Alan Bakke was a 35-year-old white man who had applied to UC Davis Medical School. He was rejected both times. The school reserved 16 places for minorities out of the 100 that they admitted. So just looking at this, it looked like Bakke could have been anywhere from 85 to 100 on the list. But due to his qualifications exceeding those of the minority students, Bakke's application was still rejected. He sued the court. He sued the UC system. Did the University of California violate his 14th Amendment rights, equal protection under the law? They agreed that it violated the Civil Rights Act. One thing that was kind of argued is that schools can't use specific racial quotas to admit people. That is a violation of the 14th Amendment. But schools are often kind of given the leeway to have diversity offices and look to make a school more diverse. So it's kind of a double-edged sword when we talk about affirmative action. There is a current case going on now in Harvard where some Asian Americans are suing Harvard based on their admission policies. This case is going to be decided anytime now. It's been argued, and a federal court judge is going to make the decision, and we're looking to see that anytime now. And a little bit more about the case. Now, talk about the women's rights movements. I want you to know the difference is a federal feminism, equity feminism, all the way down to this radical feminism, liberal feminism, and postmodern feminism. Most women now, married women are in the workforce, 70% of them. Now, when we think about it, why are 70% of the women in the workforce now? I always say it's two reasons. One, they're able to, because they want to. And 2, they have to, because it's really hard, as we all know, to make it on just one income. Women still fight labor and wages discrimination. In Title IX of the Education Act Amendment of 72 bans discrimination in admissions, housing, roles, financial aid, faculty, staff recruitment, and pay in athletics. So we talk a little bit about some of the movements, the Me Too movement, the Time's Up movements. Then we get into gay rights, and I have a list of some of the things that have happened in Native American rights, which I'm a very big proponent of. So I want you to know that in the Alcatraz, in the Dakota Access Pipeline, and Standing Rock Tribe, and the North Dakota midterm elections, re-elections, which North Dakota controversially changed a voter ID law 3 weeks before the midterm elections, requiring people to have a street address on their ID in order to vote. On some reservations, Native Americans do not have street addresses, and they use post office boxes. So that was a big controversy that is still kind of being looked at right now. Okay, so that's Chapter 12 and Chapter 13. If you have any questions, please let me know.